G'day, I just wanted to record a quick video about loss in 9 days. Loss is a central idea within the text, so today I'll hopefully give you a good overall picture of the way that Jordan talks about loss. We'll look at who experiences loss, the way that they experience it, how loss is presented by Jordan, so through some literary devices, and then also I'll sort of summarize the author's purpose as well. I will put my email in the description below. If you have any requests or there are any videos you'd like me to make about 9 days or other texts, I'd be happy to sort of look into that. So you're welcome to email me any requests, or you can put it in the comments below and I'll also check over those. Let's get started. So firstly, I'll talk about what loss is and what are the causes of loss. Then I'll mention how individuals deal with loss differently. We'll look at some literary devices and then the author's purpose summary. So firstly, what is loss? Well, individuals experience individual loss. So the first chapter that I wanted to look at is Francis's, which is probably the main chapter or main vignette talking about loss within the text. Francis endures the death of his father, Tom, and his chapter gives us an insight into the way that he handles that, but also the way that Kip deals with that loss as well. So there are some very sort of intimate and vulnerable quotes within Francis's chapter where Jordan is using the first person to convey the suffering, I guess, of a vulnerable 13-year-old boy who's just lost his father. She says, "I'm nearly 13 and there's no one left in the world big enough to carry me under one arm. I shut my eyes and imagine Dad's legs just there." So we get a picture of a very fragile 13-year-old who's really struggling to navigate this grief. We also see loss on a societal scale, and I guess Annabelle's vignette, chapter 6, is probably the main one for this. Annabelle's chapter is set in sort of the post-war Australian society, where there are many sort of holes in the crowd because of young men that have gone to war and died, much like Jack. And she talks about people who should be dancing and talking and living and breathing. There is a literary device here, however, the main technique that Jordan's using is that same stream of consciousness style that she started chapter 1 in. And so through that, she provides an insight into Annabelle's sort of personal thoughts and feelings and how she might be somewhat overwhelmed by the state of Australian society and the loss that so many people have suffered. On that point, Annabelle also shows us that loss is a human experience, as in everyone goes through loss at some time or another in their life. And she says that each of us is thinking about someone we'll never see again. It's clear that loss is sort of a universal experience. This might be strange to say, but loss does have a small positive impact on the society within 1940s Australia, at least for women. So prior to 1940s, women were mainly limited to a very domestic role within the household. And we see that through Connie cooking and cleaning. And also within Annabelle's chapter, we see her reading her Woman's Weekly recipe and making food for her father. However, there was a time while the war was carrying on where women played a much more significant role within the workplace. So Annabelle talks about working in a munitions factory. And to some extent, we can say the war might have been a catalyst for the emancipation of women from the domestic role. How is loss presented in the text? Well, the main motif for loss is of cakes. So after the loss or the death of Tom, the Westaway family becomes really overwhelmed by all of these cakes that the community is bringing to show their, I guess, support for the family. I really find Jean's phrase here quite impactful. She says that the family is going to drown in cakes. And that shows how this loss and grief can be very overwhelming for the family. For Francis and Kip, cakes come to represent the loss and the death of their father. So even as they grow into adults, they refuse to eat cake. They won't have it for their birthday. Instead, these cream biscuits represent the celebration and family that we probably normally associate with cakes. So cakes become a sort of ubiquitous symbol of loss. There are also some very confronting depictions of loss within the text. The first one probably is Pike's description of Tom's death, splashing his brain all over the road. And the other one probably is Alec's friends, who are depicted as white blankets or just mounds on the ground, their bodies from the car accident. And through this, Jordan is showing us how fragile humans are. We really just are balloons filled with blood for her. And she thinks that life is kind of fragile or fleeting. And that leads her to the view that we need to make the most of it. Individuals deal with loss differently, and even though Kip and Francis endure the same loss with Tom's death, they deal with it in very different ways. Initially, Francis is very pragmatic or practical. He's worried about the Westaways' financial situation, and he asks, what are we going to do for money? That's quite strange because at times Francis can also kind of reject this reality altogether. At the start of chapter 5, he plays this character, the Shadow, and he also feels that during Tom's funeral, there were times when everyone was just kind of going through the motions, like they were all in a play and everyone knew their lines. So loss kind of fractures Francis's mind. His very pragmatic view of life is split, and part of him maintains that very practical outlook, but also part of him rejects reality altogether. Kip cares more about the more sentimental, intangible loss, that the family suffered, and he doesn't want to worry about money. He says quite angrily to Francis, Tom's not even been in the ground a week, and he wants to push those concerns about money aside. So this shows us, just like we might foil Kip and Francis in terms of class, Kip being a proper worker while Francis is an office worker, we can also foil them in terms of their reactions to loss or grief. A little bit more on Kip. Kip experiences kind of three losses. He has the loss of his father, but then he's also very close to Connie and plays kind of a caretaker role for Jean, and he experiences the loss of them as well. This leads or kind of shapes Kip's identity, so he comes to view family as the most important thing in life. And probably one of the most powerful quotes within 9 days is, "It's the lips that matter," as in family is the most important thing in life and we need to treasure it. He feels a sense of regret, never saying goodbye to Tom because he was reading a book, and he also didn't get to say goodbye to Connie, much like Connie really had a short goodbye to Jack as well. And this shapes his personality too. Jordan shows us that we're not always able to pick our goodbyes. And overall, Kip becomes really a family man and exemplifies the importance of family. One more point on loss, and this is how loss kind of impacts intergenerationally. Perhaps one of the most tragic moments of the text is Jean's funeral, and we really only get a small insight into this through Annabelle's chapter. But Annabelle tells us that Jean has had the smallest funeral that St. Ignatius has ever seen. And this is, of course, because of Connie. Connie's death, being very public, shaped the way that the Westaways were viewed in Richmond. And so no one, I guess, wanted to support Jean or the Westaway family after Jean's death. And this kind of justifies the things that Jean's been saying. Jean has a very pessimistic life view. And when she finds out that Connie is pregnant with Jack's child, she calls Connie or labels her with a bunch of slurs and epithets. She does that regretfully, but she does so knowing that that's what other people will say to Connie. So she feels like she's almost preparing Connie for the way that people are going to react to her. And we see this play out in the way that people react to Jean's death and how they are kind of holding a grudge over this reputation within conservative Richmond. So just to summarize, loss is something that everyone experiences. It's an existential struggle that we all have to endure. War causes societal loss, which has very significant social impacts, and we can say progresses women's rights to some extent. Individuals suffer loss differently. Even very similar people like Francis and Kip, who were born just minutes apart, experience loss in a very different way, and it's a moment where their path kind of diverges and they go down separate sort of lives. Jordan overall is urging us to treasure our relationships because life is short and fleeting and it can be taken away very easily. And in a more sort of negative way, she also shows us that loss can have a prolonged effect, right, within the lives of individuals, but also in shaping family. That's loss, so hopefully that gives you a good picture of it. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll aim to address all of them. And thank you for watching.